The Neo Geo Repair-a-thon begins. This is the first system from a huge Neo Geo lot that I bought from Japan. It came with 6 systems, 12 controllers, and 5 games. If you haven't seen the unboxing, it's linked in the description. Here I have the unit with the lowest serial number to kick off the series. As much as I'd love to test all 6 systems from the get-go and tell you what's wrong with them in one video, I'm barely equipped to work on one project at a time, let alone 5 or 6. Given the investment I have in these systems, I'm going to be very cautious in how I go about testing them. Earlier, Neo Geos ran on 5 volts rather than 9 volts, and the labels are not a perfect way to figure out which system you have. I'm going to open the system and examine the motherboard so I know how much power it needs. There are 3 rubber feet that need to be removed to expose the screws underneath. I'm going to warm them up to soften the adhesive so that I can reuse them. And it turns out this is indeed a 5 volt unit. The 9 volt unit would have had a voltage regulator here. It would have also had a coil right up here, and these 2 diodes would have been populated. Visually inspecting this unit, a little bit of residue next to the cartridge slot, but nothing else really jumps out. I'm gonna have to hook up a makeshift power supply until I get a high quality one later. Here I have a power supply for an old LCD monitor. I wired it up to an inexpensive buck converter. You can get these for about $5 on Amazon. I'm gonna step the voltage down to 5 volts, and I'm gonna wire up a barrel jack from my parts bin so I get a center negative output. Here I'm just using continuity to figure out whether the center pin is my white or solid wire on this cable. Center negative power supplies are pretty uncommon these days, so it's unlikely you even have one, unless you happen to own one of these older systems like the Neo Geo, the Genesis Model 1, the Sega CD, and a bunch of others. I can toggle between the input and output voltages. It looks like my output's at 13 volts right now, so I'm going to turn down this potentiometer to get it down to 5 volts. Let me make sure I hooked everything up correctly, and I'm getting a center negative 5 volts. Black in the center, red in the outside, so this is center negative 5 volts. The Neo Geo shares the same AV cable as a Genesis Model 1 or a Sega Master System, so while the power supply is a little bit quirky, there's certainly no shortage of aftermarket AV cables for the system. Alright, let's fire this puppy up and see what we got. If the system was working properly, we should have seen a solid blue screen. I hadn't figured it out at this stage in the repair, but a green screen is actually the system trying to tell me something. We'll get to that a little bit later in the video. Let's see what happens when we insert a game cartridge. I know that 2 of the games that I bought were advertised as working, while the other 3 were sold as untested, but all the other cartridges gave me a similar result off camera. So there's clearly something wrong with this system, but quite frankly, I was relieved that the system even turned on at all, because the biggest risk with these 5 volt units is people using the wrong power adapter and completely frying the motherboard. My first inclination is to do a physical inspection, see if anything jumps out. Here I'm just taking a closer look at the underside of the AV connector, making sure none of the pins are broken. It looks like the power jack might have been repaired at some point. Those don't look like factory solder blobs, but both connectors look fine. Next, I just want to examine the board a little bit more closely, looking for any sign of corrosion, oxidation, rust, water damage, the usual suspects. I notice a little bit of solder mask, possibly from a prior repair attempt. It also wouldn't have been unusual if it came like that from the factory. A little bit of caked on gunk up here, but it cleaned right up. There are no problems here. Next, I focus my attention on that stain I spotted earlier. I'm just cleaning it up with some 99% IPA, see if there's anything going on in this corner. This turned out to be a pretty stubborn stain, and it revealed a little bit of discoloration underneath. I took my time to clean it up the best I could so I could examine the traces a little bit more closely here and make sure they were all working properly. Multimeter in continuity mode. Then check all the traces that were near the stain one by one to make sure there's continuity where they're supposed to be. This next trace looked like it disappeared underneath this chip. I ran the multimeter lead across all the pins to see if I could find continuity, but I couldn't find any. I spent a little bit more time on this pin thinking I was onto something, but it turns out it just disappears under that chip and then emerges from a via on the other side of the board, so back to square one. And nearby that stain, I noticed what appeared to be pitting in a couple of traces, so I spent a little bit of time there as well to clean them up and check for continuity. It looks like no problems here either. Both of these traces are going where they need to go. I wasn't finding anything, so I thought I'd take a look underneath this piece of electrical tape. It has a circular impression in the center where it looks like the top case rests on the motherboard. I thought maybe the pressure from the top case might have caused some damage underneath. Interesting design choice to protect the motherboard, but it appears to have done its job because after cleaning the residue underneath, there were no signs of damage here either. A short while later, I noticed what appeared to be some pitting on the top side of the CPU. This is a Motorola 68000 CPU running at 12 MHz, and based on my research, both Toshiba and Hitachi were licensed by Motorola to make these CPUs. It looks like all the top pins go down to these two Sony RAM ICs. Since they all go to the same area, instead of following them one by one, I just slide my multimeter lead across the pins looking for continuity. Up until this point, everything seemed to be checking out, but once I moved on to the next pin, I wasn't able to find continuity on the RAM ICs. This area began to look promising, so I kept moving to see if there were any other traces that I wouldn't be able to find continuity for. And I believe I found one more. Let's take a closer look at these two traces. The first thing I'm going to do is carefully scrape away some of the solder mask so I can expose some copper and see how large of a pit that we're going to need to bridge. Earlier in the video, I said that the console was actually telling me something when it powered up with a green screen, and it turns out the system displays different colors based on some basic hardware tests, and green means that there's a RAM issue. In future, if I see a green boot up screen, the first thing I'm going to do is check the traces around the RAM chips. These traces are almost microscopic, but you should be able to see the two problem areas. There's a break in the copper on the corner of this outermost trace. The one in the middle has minor pitting but looks to be good. And there's a tiny, and I mean tiny break on that third trace right next to the pin. Here you can see we have continuity down the path of the trace all the way up to the corner, but once we jump that corner, we lose continuity. The middle trace has continuity, but could probably use a little bit of reinforcement. And that last trace has no continuity until we slide all the way forward, almost touching the pin. I have some really high gauge solid core wire that I've used for trace repair on the OG Xbox, but even that I think is too thick for the size of these traces, so instead I'm just going to use some copper from this stranded wire. It should bite onto the traces a little bit better, and I think it's going to be a suitable vehicle to carry that little bit of solder across the bridge and make that connection. Here I'm adding a little bit of flux so I can pre-tin those three traces. Once they're tinned, they're a little bit shinier, so you can actually see the breaks in the traces I was pointing out earlier a little bit more clearly in this shot right here. My goal is to anchor the wire into position, then I'll come back and reinforce it so it's a stronger connection. That should take care of the bottom trace. For the middle trace, I'm just going to reinforce it with solder. I don't think it needs a wire. It wasn't broken, it just looked like it might be on its way out. And now for the top trace. This one gave me a bit of a harder time. There just wasn't enough copper on that bend where the trace turns a corner. So I just anchored it closer to the pin before it turns that bend so the wire has more to bite onto. And once that flux residue is all cleaned up, I can inspect my work. Time for a continuity check, make sure none of the adjacent traces are shorted. All good. And those 3 pins all have continuity. Alright, time to test. I'm not a big fan of overreactions on camera. You'll just have to take my word for it when I tell you I was ecstatic, guys. We'll test everything more thoroughly towards the end. Let's wrap up this restoration and finish putting everything back together. Here I'm just using some nail polish as an overcoat to prevent future oxidation. I like using nail polish because it's reversible. A drop of acetone and I can clean this up and rework this area if I have to. And I know there's nothing wrong with this power connector, but this prior repair attempt is making me itch. I'm just gonna re-wet it with some flux to clean it up, make it look nice and pretty. I feel a lot better now. Last thing I'm going to do as far as the board's concerned is clean all the connectors with some contact cleaner. And I am going to replace this piece of electrical tape with a new strip. If SNK designed it to be there, I guess they did so for a good reason. For a system that's 30 years old, this case doesn't look too bad. I'm going to go ahead and give it a bath with some dish soap and warm water, get this system looking as good as we can. This thing is spotless, but the shell is obviously a little bit scuffed up. I'm going to see if I can polish that up in a minute. As for those rubber feet, I'm not going to install them just yet. I will be doing a BIOS mod on this system soon, so I'll stick those back on once I have no plans of opening the system up again. As for the polish sponge that I use on plastics, I always get questions when I use this in my videos. It's an excellent product to restore faded plastic. I've linked it in the description below. It seems to go in and out of stock at Amazon, so if you can't find the sponge, you can get the solution and just use your own applicator. It looks a little bit glossy when you first apply it, but once the oils soak into the plastic, the sheen just kind of fades away and it looks a little bit more natural. There we have it, guys. What do you guys think of this handsome boy? I'm making all my childhood dreams come true owning one of these. It was always that exotic system that I didn't know anything about, none of my friends had, but I can appreciate the system today in ways that I would have never been able to when I was a kid growing up. I plan to offer some of these for sale on my website once I get a few more working, but I still have a ways to go with all the controllers I need to refurbish, the BIOS mods, and I'm still waiting for the power adapters to come in, so stay tuned. Episode 2 coming soon. Stick around if you want to see some gameplay, otherwise I'll see you guys next week.
Round one, fight! Round two, fight! Time over! Round three, fight! Fuka!